If someone disrespects you, it's rarely about what you say in that moment. It's about what you allow over time. Most people think respect is demanded through loud words, arguments, or proving a point. But the truth is simpler and harder. Respect is enforced silently. And the people who understand this rarely need to speak twice. Before we go further, subscribe to Inner Steel for more lessons on discipline, silence, and power. Because today, you're going to learn 5 silent moves that don't just stop disrespect. They make people think twice before trying it again. Withdraw your attention without explanation. Attention is the most underestimated currency in human interaction. Most people give it away freely, especially when emotions are involved. They argue, explain, defend themselves, and try to fix how they're perceived. But the moment someone disrespects you, and you keep engaging, you've already lowered your value. There was a man who used to respond to every slight. If she made a sarcastic comment, he corrected her. If she dismissed him, he explained himself. If she raised her voice, he matched her energy. He thought he was standing up for himself. But from her perspective, he was predictable. Every reaction he gave confirmed one thing. She could control his emotional state. One day, something changed. She made a sharp comment in front of others, something meant to embarrass him. Normally, he would have responded immediately. But this time, he didn't. He looked at her, said nothing, and shifted his attention elsewhere. No argument. No correction. No visible reaction. Just absence. That silence did more than any comeback ever could. Because now, she had no emotional feedback to work with. No reaction to validate her behavior. And for the first time, she felt uncertain. That's the power of withdrawal. When you remove your attention without explanation, you create a psychological gap. And people don't like gaps. They start questioning themselves. Did I go too far? Why didn't he react? Did I lose his interest? Silence forces reflection. Words often destroy it. Maintain emotional control under pressure. Disrespect often comes with emotional bait. A raised voice. A sarcastic tone. A dismissive look. It's not always about what's said. It's about triggering a reaction. Most people fail here. They get pulled into the emotion of the moment. They react instantly. And in doing so, they lose authority. There was a situation between 2 colleagues. One was calm, composed, and reserved. The other was expressive, reactive, and often crossed boundaries. One day, during a heated discussion, the second person tried to dominate the conversation. Interrupting. Raising their voice. Pushing buttons. Everyone expected the calm one to snap. But he didn't. He paused. Looked directly at them. And spoke slowly. Lower your voice. Then we can continue. No anger. No tension. No emotional spike. Just control. The room went quiet. Because emotional discipline is rare. And when people see it, they adjust. Disrespect thrives in chaos. When you stay grounded, you remove the environment it needs to survive. You don't need to overpower someone emotionally. You need to outlast them. Set boundaries through action, not words. People often talk about boundaries. They say things like, "Don't talk to me like that. I deserve respect. I won't tolerate this." But then, they tolerate it. Again and again. And eventually, their words lose meaning. Real boundaries are not spoken. They are enforced. There was a man who kept hearing the same thing from someone close to him. Subtle disrespect disguised as jokes. At first, he laughed it off. Then he mentioned it bothered him. Nothing changed. So he changed something else. He reduced access. Less time. Less availability. Less engagement. He didn't announce it. He didn't explain it. He just moved differently. At first, it went unnoticed. Then slowly, the shift became obvious. Now the same person who once felt comfortable crossing lines started being careful. Because access had value. And now it wasn't guaranteed. That's what boundaries look like. Not loud declarations, but quiet adjustments that reshape how people treat you. If someone disrespects you and nothing changes afterward, you've just trained them to continue. Stop explaining yourself. Over-explaining is a hidden form of weakness. It often comes from a need to be understood, accepted, or validated. But here's the problem. The more you explain yourself, the more you signal that you need approval. And people who sense that will test you. There was a situation where someone constantly questioned a man's decisions. Why did you do that? That doesn't make sense. You should have handled it differently. At first, he explained everything. His reasoning. His thought process. His intentions. But no matter how clear he was, the questioning didn't stop. Because it was never about understanding. It was about control. So he changed his response. Instead of long explanations, he started saying, "That's how I chose to handle it." And then, silence. No justification. No debate. Just certainty. At first, it created tension. But over time, something shifted. The questions became less frequent. The challenges became weaker. Because when you stop seeking validation, people lose leverage over you. You don't need everyone to understand you. You need to understand yourself. Be willing to walk away. This is the move most people avoid. Because it requires the one thing many struggle with: detachment. If you're afraid to lose someone, they will eventually sense it. And once they do, your leverage disappears. Disrespect becomes easier. Because they believe you'll stay anyway. There was a relationship where one person kept crossing lines. Small things at first. Then bigger ones. Each time, there were conversations. Promises. Temporary change. But the pattern remained. Until one day, there was no argument. No long discussion. No emotional scene. Just a decision. He left. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. And that's what made it powerful. Because walking away silently forces reality to hit harder. No noise to soften the impact. No words to negotiate. Just absence. And absence speaks loudly. Sometimes, respect only appears when access disappears. Not because people suddenly change, but because they realize they lost something they can't easily replace. Final message. Disrespect is rarely about a single moment. It's about patterns. What you tolerate. What you respond to. What you ignore. And most importantly, what you enforce without words. You don't need to be louder. You don't need better comebacks. You need control. You need clarity. You need discipline. Because the strongest message you can send is the one that doesn't need to be repeated. Most people think the moment you walk away is the end of the story. It's not. It's the beginning of a different kind of conversation, one that doesn't use words. Because when you remove yourself without drama, without insults, without trying to win, you leave something behind that most people aren't used to facing. Uncertainty. There was a period where a man completely stopped engaging with someone who had grown comfortable disrespecting him. No arguments, no emotional goodbye, no long explanations about why he was leaving. He simply became unavailable. At first, nothing happened. Days passed. Then weeks. On the surface, it looked like everything moved on normally. But underneath, something started to shift. The same person who once spoke carelessly started replaying past interactions in their mind. They remembered the tone they used. The moments they crossed a line. The times they assumed he would always be there, no matter how they behaved. And now, there was no way to correct it. No access. No conversation. No opportunity to smooth things over. That's the part people underestimate. When you stay and argue, you give the other person chances to defend themselves, to twist the narrative, to downplay what they did. But when you leave silently, you take all of that away. You leave them alone with their own thoughts. And most people are far more affected by what they tell themselves in silence than anything you could say out loud. But this only works if your silence is real, not temporary, not a tactic to get a reaction. It has to come from a place of certainty. Because if you leave, but you're constantly checking, waiting, hoping they reach out, you haven't really left. You've just changed positions. There's another layer to this that most people ignore. Silence exposes who people really are. When you stop reacting, stop explaining, stop chasing, people are forced to decide how they see you without your influence. Some will respect you more. Others will drift away. And a few will try to test you again, just to see if your silence is real or if it's just another phase. There was a moment where someone re-entered a man's life after a long period of distance. The tone was different this time. More careful. More measured. But eventually a small test appeared, something subtle, something that looked harmless on the surface but carried the same underlying disrespect as before. This is where most people fail. They think time alone changes people. It doesn't. Time only reveals whether change actually happened. He noticed it immediately. But instead of reacting emotionally, instead of confronting it directly, he simply adjusted again. Less engagement. Less presence. No announcement. And that was enough. Because now the message was clear. Nothing had changed about his standards. And more importantly, nothing had changed about his willingness to enforce them. Consistency is what turns silence into power. Anyone can act differently once. Very few people can maintain it. There's also a quiet confidence that comes with no longer needing to prove anything. When you stop explaining yourself, stop defending your choices, stop trying to control how others see you, you free up energy. And that energy shows. There was a time when a man would carefully choose his words, trying to avoid being misunderstood. He would adjust his tone, soften his opinions, and sometimes even hold back entirely, just to keep things smooth. But all it did was create an imbalance. Because the more he adjusted himself, the more others felt comfortable staying exactly the same. Until he stopped. He began speaking simply. Directly. Without extra explanation. Not aggressive. Not rude. Just clear. And when something wasn't respected, he didn't try to convince anyone to understand. He just changed how much access they had to him. At first, some people saw it as distance. Others saw it as pride. But over time, something else became clear. He wasn't trying to control anyone. He was controlling himself. And that's the difference. You can't force respect. But you can remove yourself from environments where it doesn't exist. There's also a level of discipline required to not fall back into old patterns. Because familiarity is comfortable. Even if it comes with disrespect. Even if it slowly lowers your standards. There was a moment where someone tried to reconnect with charm, humor, and a sense of familiarity, bringing back old memories, inside jokes, and the version of the relationship that once felt easy. And for a second, it worked. It felt natural to respond the same way as before. To fall back into the rhythm. But that's where awareness matters. Because not every connection deserves to be rebuilt just because it feels familiar. He recognized it. And instead of rejecting it harshly, he simply didn't invest in it. He responded less. Engaged less. Stayed neutral. And eventually, the dynamic couldn't sustain itself. Because it relied on a version of him that no longer existed. Growth isn't loud. It doesn't need announcements. It shows in what you no longer tolerate. In what you no longer respond to. In what you quietly walk away from. And one of the strongest shifts happens when you stop seeing disrespect as something personal. Because most of the time, it isn't. It's a reflection of the other person's habits, boundaries, and level of awareness. When someone disrespects you, they're not always making a calculated decision about your worth. They're operating at their own level. And once you understand that, you stop reacting emotionally. You start observing instead. You start deciding. There was a situation where someone made a dismissive remark in a group setting. Before, it would have triggered an immediate response. A correction. A defense. A need to re-establish position. But this time, There was none of that. He heard it, recognized it, and chose not to engage. Not out of fear, but out of control. Because not every situation deserves your energy. And not every comment deserves your response. The conversation moved on. But something else happened quietly. The people around noticed. Not the comment, but the lack of reaction. The composure. The restraint. And that's something people rarely forget. Because in a world where most people react instantly, the one who doesn't stands out. Over time, this builds a different kind of presence. You don't need to assert yourself constantly. You don't need to remind people how to treat you. They learn it. From your patterns. From your consistency. From your silence. And eventually, something interesting happens. People begin to adjust before crossing a line. Not because you warned them, but because they've seen what happens when they do. They've felt the distance, the withdrawal, the absence, and they don't want to experience it again. That's when respect becomes natural. Not forced. Not negotiated. Just understood. But it all comes back to one thing. You have to be willing to lose people. Not recklessly. Not out of ego. But out of self-respect. Because if you're not willing to walk away, everything else becomes a performance. Your silence won't be taken seriously. Your boundaries won't hold. Your presence won't carry weight. People can sense hesitation. They can feel when your actions don't match your standards. And once they do, they adjust accordingly. So the real question isn't whether these silent moves work. They do. The question is whether you can maintain them. When it's uncomfortable. When it feels easier to explain. When it feels easier to react. When it feels easier to stay. Because that's where most people break. They understand the principle. But they don't follow through. And without consistency, even the strongest mindset fades. In the end, respect isn't built in a single moment. It's built in patterns. In repeated actions. In quiet decisions that most people never see. And the strongest position you can be in is one where your presence is valued, but your absence is understood. There's a subtle shift that happens when you begin to live this way consistently. At first, it feels unnatural. You notice the urge to respond, to correct, to explain, to make sure people don't misunderstand you. That urge doesn't disappear overnight. It shows up in small moments. A comment that feels slightly disrespectful. A tone that feels dismissive. A situation where the old version of you would have reacted instantly. And in those moments, the real work begins. Because silence is not just about staying quiet. It's about restraint. There was a time when a man received a message that carried a familiar tone, subtle, but clearly lacking respect. Nothing extreme. Nothing obvious. Just enough to provoke a reaction. Before, he would have replied quickly. Adjusted the tone. Made sure the conversation stayed balanced. But this time, he paused. He read it once. Then again. And instead of replying immediately, he put the phone down. Minutes passed. Then hours. Not as a strategy, but as a choice. By the time he came back to it, the need to respond had faded. And with that, clarity appeared. Not everything needs an answer. Not every message deserves your time. And sometimes, the strongest reply is none at all. That's when you start to understand something deeper. Your time and attention are not obligations. They are choices. And when you treat them that way, people begin to feel it. They notice delays where there used to be urgency. They notice calm where there used to be reaction. They notice distance where there used to be constant presence. And that shift creates awareness. Because now, interactions are no longer automatic. They are earned. There's also a different level of confidence that begins to develop. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that needs to prove itself in conversations or arguments. But a quiet certainty. A sense that you don't need to chase understanding. You don't need to fix every perception. You don't need to win every interaction. There was a situation where someone tried to provoke a reaction publicly, using humor as a cover, but with an edge that was clearly meant to test boundaries. People laughed. They looked over, waiting to see how he would respond. Moments like that can go in many directions. You can match the energy. You can shut it down aggressively. You can try to outdo the comment. But he didn't do any of that. He acknowledged it with a brief glance, and then continued the conversation he was already having with someone else. No shift in tone. No change in posture. No sign that it affected him. And that did something unexpected. It removed the spotlight from the person trying to create it. Because without reaction, there was nothing to build on. No tension. No back and forth. No escalation. Just a moment that faded on its own. That's something most people never learn. Not every challenge needs to be met head-on. Some are better dissolved. Ignored not out of weakness, but out of control. Over time, these small decisions build something stronger than any single action. They build a reputation. Not one you announce, but one people experience. They start to notice patterns. They realize you don't engage in unnecessary conflict. You don't chase conversations that lack respect. You don't adjust your behavior to fit someone else's mood. And because of that, they adjust. Not always consciously, but gradually. Because people naturally respond to consistency. There was a period where someone tried multiple approaches to break that consistency. Sometimes it was subtle disrespect. Other times it was emotional pressure. Occasionally it was friendliness, trying to bring things back to how they used to be. But the response stayed the same. Calm. Measured. Unreactive. And eventually, the attempts stopped. Not because of confrontation. But because there was no reward. No reaction. No engagement. No shift. And without those things, the behavior had nothing to feed on. That's when you realize something important. Disrespect often survives on attention. Remove the attention, and it loses strength. But this doesn't mean becoming cold or distant with everyone. It means becoming selective. There's a difference. You still engage. You still connect. You still show presence. But only where it's mutual. Only where it's respected. And that selectiveness changes everything. Because now, your energy is no longer spread thin. It's focused. Intentional. Valued. There was a time when a man would give the same level of attention to everyone. Quick replies. Full engagement. Consistent availability. It felt normal. But over time, it created imbalance. Because not everyone valued it the same way. Some appreciated it. Others took it for granted. And a few began to expect it. That's where the shift had to happen. He didn't withdraw from everyone. He just became more aware. Who respects your time? Who listens when you speak? Who crosses lines and pretends it's nothing? And based on those answers, he adjusted. Not with announcements. Not with explanations. Just with behavior. More presence where it was valued. Less where it wasn't. And that alone reshaped how people interacted with him. Because access was no longer automatic. It was responsive. There's also a moment where you stop needing closure. That's a level many people struggle to reach. They want to explain everything before they leave. They want the other person to understand. To acknowledge. To admit fault. But that rarely happens the way you expect. And even when it does, it often changes nothing. There was a situation where everything pointed to one conclusion. The pattern was clear. The behavior repeated. The respect wasn't there. And still, there was a temptation to have one last conversation. To lay everything out. To make it clear. But instead, he chose silence. Not because he didn't have anything to say. But because he understood something most people don't. Closure is internal. It doesn't come from the other person. It comes from your decision to stop engaging. To stop hoping. To stop waiting for something to change. And once that decision is made, there's nothing left to explain. You move forward. Quietly. And that's where real freedom begins. Because now, your peace is no longer dependent on someone else's behavior. It's based on your standards, your choices, your discipline. There will still be moments that test you, situations that pull at old habits, people who try to re enter your life with familiar patterns. But each time, the same principle applies. Observe, decide, act accordingly, without noise, without emotion, without needing validation. And over time, something becomes very clear. The less you react, the more you see. The less you explain, the more people reveal themselves. The less you chase, the more you understand who actually values your presence. And that understanding changes everything. Because now, you're not just avoiding disrespect. You're filtering it out before it even reaches you. Through your standards. Through your consistency. Through your silence. Subscribe to Inner Steel for more lessons on silence, discipline, and power. Stay sharp.